In tonight's Kaleidoscope feature, Ian McMillan goes in search of those for whom the beat goes on, beginning in the house of Kevin Ring on the outskirts of Coventry, where he's poring over his photographic memories.
Well, there's 3 photos here. In some respects, my favourite pictures. There's Neil Cassidy on the left, posing outside. It looks like the Naval Recruitment Office. I think he's in his sort of final years. This picture might have been taken. He's got a strong arm man pose here. Toothbrush, very much like Kerouac, in top pocket. I think it must have been taken about a year, maybe 2 before he died, in 1968. The middle one is a film poster of Jack Kerouac with Joyce Johnson in the background there. This is, I take it to have been taken on the eve of the publication of On the Road in 1957.
I'm halfway up the stairs in Kevin Ring's neat house on the outskirts of Coventry. It's a kind of shrine. Kevin is the editor of Beat Scene, a magazine devoted not only to contemporary beat writing, but also to the great heroes of the beat generation: Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Gregory Corso, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, and above all, the man who inspired my own Barnsley beat meanderings as the mid-70s faded away in albums by Mud and Platform Souls as high as heaven, Jack Kerouac.
Well, it's Kerouac for me. You know, Kerouac, you know, the rest sort of pale into insignificance, really. Just the humility, the kind of bearing of the soul, the sort of truthfulness, the honesty, the fact that he was prepared to put something into print, bearing his soul, and he made an epic out of everyday life.
It's Kerouac for me, too. I discovered him when I was in the 5th year at Wath Grammar School, near Rotherham. Rotherham is as far from the American dream as you can get without falling off. 6 lifts on the M1, and you're still nowhere. Or Wakefield, which is the same thing. It was 1973. Kerouac had been dead 4 years, and I read my favourite passage of his under the desk in Mr. Fleming's history class, over and over. The only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, 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 like the fabulous yellow Roman candles exploding like spiders across the stars. I know it by heart now. I had to write it out 20 times when Mr. Fleming caught me. He was mad.
There was a little alley in San Francisco, back of the Southern Pacific Station at 3rd and Townsend, in red brick of drowsy, lazy afternoons with everybody at work in offices. In the air you feel the impending rush of a commuter frenzy. As soon they'll be charging en masse from Market and Sansom buildings on foot and in buses and all well-dressed through working man Frisco of walk-up truck drivers. And even
it took poetry out of the academy onto the streets. It popularised the idea of poetry readings. I think there's no doubt about the fact that it's in the early 60s that the idea of live performance, of poetry being read aloud as well as being read on the page.
It was poetry that was performed. It was poetry which was American and which took the same liberties with literary syntax as jazz took with musical syntax. I was definitely interested in the fact that Ginsberg was very, very inventive by using or not using punctuation, by the way in which he used nouns as adjectives. Like fireplace Chicago is one that comes to mind. Fireplace as an adjective describing Chicago, audaciously and graphically. A lot of us didn't have a jazz literary inheritance. We had no vocabulary with which to write a literature which was an equivalent of jazz or which had its roots in the same instinct or the same kind of psychological content. It seemed to me that at last there were some people here who had some precursors like Kenneth Fearing and Kenneth Rexroth, and certain aspects of E.E. Cummings had attempted to do similar things before, but who were giving voice to these original and seemingly indelibly American things which we recognized in jazz and which we wanted, because it was explosive, because it was simultaneously anguished and celebratory, because it was erotic, and that is tremendously important, I think. It was outwardly and bluntly and militantly erotic. It was transgressorial. It was naughty. Bloodlet, melt-light, apple-bleed, catch sun late gurgling in its westerly mess. They run out shrieking geese across the darkening, the dead girls. I don't want to look at the cuts on her arms. I've an eye full of glass. I've a head full of metal. I'm cool, baby, cool. Okay, I keep telling you. Child on glass, candle snot, grief, dirty cut, pain of the rough cold flannel. No, sir.
There was a little alley in San Francisco, back of the Southern Pacific Station at 3rd and Townsend. In red brick of drowsy, lazy afternoons with everybody at work in offices. In the air you feel the impending rush of their commuter frenzy. As soon they'll be charging en masse for market and Sansom buildings on foot and in buses and all well-dressed through working man Frisco of walk-up truck drivers. And even the poor grime-bemarked 3rd Street of lost bums, even Negroes so hopeless and long left east, and meanings of responsibility and try, that now all they do is stand there spitting in the broken glass, sometimes 50 in one afternoon against one wall at 3rd and Howard. Here's all these Milbrae and San Carlos neat neckties.
Jack Kerouac, master of spontaneous bop prosody. Before him, Jeff Nuttall, towering figure of the 60s, whose poetry I read in a Penguin Modern Poets in Smith's in Barnsley in 1974, as my mum looked at cards for our Harry's birthday, and my dad brought a Trougham salmon with the River Tweed on the cover. Before Jeff Nuttall, the voice of Jim Burns, bespectacled guru of Preston in the mid-70s, when I sent my hesitant early poems to his magazine Palantir, and he sent them back, and I stuck his rejection letters to my bedroom wall, next rejection slips from Outposts, Poetry Review, and the TLS, and a picture of Les Gray, lead singer of Mud.
By travelling down to London or seeing advertisements in odd magazines for someone would be publishing a magazine, so you'd write away and get a copy, and maybe get in touch with people, and after a time you'd realise that there was someone else out there. I mean, you know, Dave Cunliffe, who lived in Blackburn 10 miles away, we eventually discovered each other in the early 60s, to our great delight. And we used to sort of travel down from Preston to Blackburn or Blackburn to Preston to meet each other just to get together to talk, because it really was that small kind of community. And you became conscious of the fact that there were a scattering of people out there. There were several in Liverpool. I mean, the Liverpool poets, Adrian Henry in particular, Henry Graham, Brian Patton, Roger McGough, and several others, Spike Hawkins, who were all centred in and around Liverpool at that time, Tom Pickard and one or two others up in Newcastle. A scattering of other people around about who weren't all necessarily beat inclined, but I think they all had an interest in that kind of work, and certainly in all the American new writing of that period, you became conscious of the fact that there were these people out there, and you made contact with them and travelled to see them, and had this network of small magazines, very cheaply produced magazines, duplicated mimeograph magazines as they called them in those days. What I find when I dig out the old magazines is that in those days there was a lot of bad but interesting poetry written. Nowadays there's a lot of good but dull poetry written.
It's hard to describe how dull and far from the centre of things Barnsley felt in the mid-70s. It was like living in an unfashionable shoe that someone had thrown away. The Beats and their British followers lit up my life when I discovered them in magazines like Palantir and Second Eon, but my excitement was only a pale imitation of that which exploded onto the dull grey British literary scene of the late 50s, early 60s.
I couldn't understand really why people like Kingsley Amis, John Wayne, Anthony Sweet, and all these boring poets were so published and read, for God's sake. Well, I don't know whether they read or not, who knows. They just published each other, honestly. But that's called establishment clique, and the Robert Conquest crowd, what's it called, New Directions. Big joke. New? It was like ancient stuff dolled up. It was really Edward Thomas, Hardy, 9th century stuff. The boredom, the dullness of the establishment poetry was unbelievable. They had the nerve to call themselves the movement later. I mean, dogmatists usually do. But the idea was there must be something else.
Eric Mottram, former professor at King's College, London, articulating what loads of British writers felt in the 60s, from Preston to Blackburn, from Bradford to Bristol. There must be something else. Two more British beat writers who influenced me in the 70s were David Tipton, editor of Rivelin Press, and Dave Cunliffe, editor of the Global Tapestry Journal. I went to see them, either side of the Pennines, in true beat fashion. 8 lifts, sandwiches at Hartshead Moor service station on a following wind. I had a bit of cardboard with Radio 4 programme maker on it. People waved at me as they swept past. David Tipton.
I was brought up during the war, and at that time we were probably the most propagandized generation. And until I went into the forces and began to think for myself and realized what society was really about, I'd accepted the propaganda whole. And I think this happened in the States as well, you see. And a lot of these people had gone through the war and were reacting against this crazy political system that we found ourselves in.
I was born in a northern working class environment. When I was a child, I was into street gangs, petty criminality, fighting, the early Teddy Boy stuff. It was liberating to know that there was actually a world, more exciting world of creativity and lifestyle and travel and new experiences and, and literature. I mean, there was all psychologies, philosophies, religions. It was all waiting to be discovered, and there's just a myriad of excitements out there. Without that kind of a literary movement, I'd probably finish up working in a grocery store and retiring with a gold watch.
And into the lives of war babies in provincial British towns came this voice, as it came to me 10 years later, as I twiddled with the radio knobs because I was fed up of reading The Rape of the Lock, my A-level set text. William Burroughs, El Hombre Invisible. I wrote an essay the next day comparing and contrasting The Rape of the Lock to The Naked Lunch. The teacher said I'd better pull my socks up. I disdained the school bus, hitched home and missed my tea. William Burroughs.
When you come to the end of a biologic film, just run it back and start over. Nobody knows the difference. It's like nobody there before the film. So they start to run it back, and the projector blew up, and we land out of there on the blast. Holed up in those cool blue mountains, listening to the little hi-fi junk note fixes you right to metal, and you're not out 1,000 years.
It's hard for us now, in the eclectic 90s, to imagine the impact that stuff like that had. British writing was a chapel garden party, and the beats were the lads from the church youth club who'd had too much bottled cider and were disrupting the tombola. In search of British beat, I hitched back to Cheshire and then down to London to talk to Jim Burns and Jeff Nuttall about liberation. Well, I didn't hitch, I caught the train, but it was second class, and there were no Danish pastries in the buffet. I still had my bit of cardboard with Radio 4 programme maker on it. I flung it out of the window near Tamworth, and it flew across the fields like a rare bird.
After I came out of the army in the late 50s, On the Road was published in this country in, 1958. And that was about the time when I started getting interested and started going down to London a lot, really, because that was the only place you could get those kind of books. And the small City Lights books, Ginsberg's Howl, and a few others were available in the London bookshops, and as I say, and On the Road was published here in 58. So the stuff was beginning to filter through. I found out after a time that there was so many different varieties of beat poetry, really. There were as much beat poetry as there were beat poets. Each poet Corso had his own style, Ginsberg had his own style, Kerouac, when he wrote poetry, and some of his prose, his poetry, very much had his own style. I think, to me, that what it seemed to represent in those days was something that was outside the establishment, and certainly outside the university. It was outside the academic setup. It seemed to be more of a poetry of the streets, seemed to be written by people who were aware of what was going on the streets, which doesn't mean to say that it was anti-intellectual, because for goodness sake, Ginsberg's poetry is loaded with intellectual references. I mean, he's obviously a very, very knowledgeable man.
It has to be thought of, predominantly literary. It was a movement invented by writers for writers, initially. Its centres were bookshops, not bars, not cabarets, not discos, not even Mediterranean or West Coast beaches. Its centres were actually bookshops. It was a literary thing. It extended its influence eventually to the rock movement, to the drug culture, to the hippie culture, quite quickly. But initially, at the height of its power and the height of its achievements, the writers, Corso, Ginsberg, Kerouac, Lamantia, Michael McClure, and so on,